Welcome. Just as we were starting this meeting, I opened a package that I received a few minutes ago, and it's none other than one of the most exciting packages I'll get, at least today. And it is the 22nd edition of the North American Mission Handbook, which lists, it's a directory of mission agencies in the United States and Canada. And I'll pass it around if you want to take a look at it. Cindy Wu, who is a student here, one of my students, and I wrote a book together a couple of years ago called Our Global Families, and we wrote the first chapter of this as an introduction to what's going on. And this is a pretty helpful book, and will be in the library where you can look at it, but it's just hot off the press. So can I pass this around? Try not to get any pizza on it. All right, so I'm going to do something simple, which is to summarize all of the main trends in Christianity, religion, and in mission. Okay, and then we can talk about it. So if you have questions, hopefully we'll have a chance to go through that. I owe a lot to two different people. One became my father-in-law. The other was my mentor for many years. David Barrett on the left, both now have passed away. He started the work that I'm doing 52 years ago. So our research center has been in continuous process of research for 52 years. That is very, very rare, even in the academic world, to see that kind of consistency. Barrett was a playful person. I'll tell you one story about each of these. Barrett was asked to speak at a meeting with a bunch of wealthy people in it, and they wanted to give their money where evangelism would be the most effective. Unfortunately for that audience, Barrett and I had been studying Christian martyrdom, and so they said, just tell us what is most effective. So he said, well, based on our recent study, we think the most effective means of evangelization is Christian martyrdom. So there's a long silence in this room, and finally one of these people screwed up the courage and raised their hand and said, Dr. Barrett, would you tell us the second most effective means of evangelization? So that says a lot about mission in itself there. Then Ralph Winter. I married Ralph's youngest daughter, Tricia. They were missionaries in Guatemala for many years, Presbyterian missionaries, and then Donald McGavran invited Winter to the newly formed School of World Mission at Fuller in Pasadena. And then 10 years working there, he actually launched out and started the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena. And I worked there one summer. I actually knew him first and then his daughter. And I had to go in to ask him for her hand in marriage. So I sat down across from him and said, I really like your daughter and I think we could get along really well. And he looked at me, just penetrating look at me, and he said, if you had $1,000 and you put it in the bank for 20 years at 5% interest, how much money would you have at the end? So that's one of those that you don't quite expect. He loved growth rates and calculus and everything. So I told him how to calculate it. It's about $2,652, if I remember right, from 33 years ago. So this was important to him, that you could calculate. So that was kind of the way I launched off of my career. I was in Youth with a Mission. I was a Lutheran from Minnesota who was deeply impacted by the charismatic movement, moved to California. So after he was happy about my calculations, he said to me, if I was a charismatic, I'd give you a great big hug. And then he shook my hand because he was a Presbyterian. So we got along really well. It was a wonderful place to be and a wonderful family to be a part of. All of the daughters, by the way, are involved in mission, all four of them and their husbands in different places all over the world. So it's quite a legacy for his family as well. Okay, then we tend to work on reference books, which is where some of these findings come from. The far left is the World Christian Encyclopedia 2nd edition, which I worked with bear it on. And we are producing the third edition of the encyclopedia here at Gordon-Conwell. We have another year and a half to finish. Every day we're working on different countries trying to assess what's happening in Christianity and in evangelization and mission. Then we have the Atlas of Global Christianity, which we published a few years ago. Beautiful book, full-color book. Some of my illustrations will come from there. Then the Atlas was a success enough with Edinburgh University Press in Scotland that they asked us to produce a 10-volume series on global Christianity. A few months ago, we produced the Sub-Saharan African volume, which is written by all Africans. You'll see the significance of this in just a minute. Every one of our series is edited by someone from that continent, and then all the people commenting are from that continent. Even though there are many outside experts around the world, we are getting people to tell their own story, okay? The second volume actually was announced this morning, and it's Christianity in North Africa and West Asia. You'll see the picture on the front. We're using indigenous art in every one of these, as we did with the Atlas. The picture in front is of the 21 Coptic martyrs from Libya that you might remember a couple years ago. It's a very different story. These two books are completely different in what they say about what is happening in Christianity. And then books on further volumes on Asia and the rest of the world will follow over the next 10 years. Okay, how about trends? Just some important trends in global Christianity. Let's start with our Atlas. The Atlas was a way to talk about what happened between 1910 and 2010, a 100-year period. Unfortunately for us, this is what the growth of Christianity looks like over 100 years. So, if you're in the hospital and you look over at the machine and it looks like this, that's the last thing you're going to ever see. So not really encouraging. But on the other hand, it hides some really significant trends underneath, ones that you're probably well aware of, but I want to tease out a little bit. Perhaps the most important one is the shift of Christianity from north to south. I spoke I was on sabbatical with my wife last year in Thailand for a year, and I spoke to 1,000 Thai Christians about the shift. Even the conference was called Shift, and about this shift from north to south. And of course, they're in the south. They're in a place, very small church, demographically speaking, but part of what is happening in the future of Christianity. So they saw these graphs. Everything was in Thai. It was really neat to see all of my slides in Thai. So in 1910, 66% of all Christians were Europeans, about 15% North Americans who were mainly Europeans living in North America, let's say, the European migrants in North America. So that's over 80% of all Christians are Europeans. Now watch what happens over 100 years. Just keep an eye on that blue on the bottom there. You can see it shrinks considerably. Now it's only 25% in Europe and 12% in North America. So that's under 40%. That's the shift. Europeans and North Americans, 80% of all Christians, now less than 40. And it all happened in that 100-year period. So that's a pretty well-known fact nowadays. And of course, our own seminary here has been impacted positively by this shift, both in the student body, the faculty, the courses that are being taught. This is continuing to have a big effect on us, positive effect. Okay, but I always kind of wonder, what does this actually mean, for Christians to shift demographically from north to south? And I came across this exhibition. This is a Chinese graphic designer who moved to Berlin. So one of the things she noticed is how different German culture was from Chinese culture. So she decided to do an exhibition called East versus West and put together some graphics just to contrast these two societies. Here's one. So the Germans are blue on the left, the Chinese are red on the right. So punctuality, Germans, right on time. I'm 1/4 German. I think I started exactly at 12:30 like I planned, right? Okay, so I couldn't help myself. But the Chinese, there's a little bit of play there. If we put the Latin Americans next in there, they'll just go all the way around the clock, I think. So there's always a little bit of play there. How about the handling of problems? You know, the Germans just kind of walk straight through the problem. Chinese make their way tactfully around in this sense. Even just something as simple as waiting in line. You know, the Germans neatly lined up, Chinese bunched against the window. And then how about similar to problems, opinion? Again, Germans very direct in their opinion, Chinese kind of wandering a little bit there, a little bit indirect in their opinion. Then we get to contacts, and we see that the Germans, you know, just have a few contacts, and the Chinese in a great web of relationships. And this is where I began to think about what impact does this have on Christianity? Because in a sense, we're saying Christianity was German, mainly German 100 years ago. Now it's more Chinese in the people that are becoming Christians, and the weight, the demographic weight is on the right. And what I thought about, one of the things I've studied in the past is American individualism, and which is coming out of kind of the German way of looking at things as well. And one of the things, Americans are on a big project over the last 30 years, and that is to try to regain community. There's a very famous book that was published out of Harvard here just a decade ago, I think now, called Bowling Alone, which was saying, you know, Americans have traditionally had to make community, and one of the ways my parents were involved in community was they were part of a bowling league, and they went every week, and they met for barbecues, and it was just a great way for people to come together. And Robert Putnam, who is the author of that book, said now people are just bowling alone. That's a real crisis. It's a societal crisis, but it's even more of a Christian crisis, because you're not supposed to be on your own, all by yourself. We heard the third in Lindsey Brown's comments. The third thing that was so encouraging is fellowship with other believers to be able to go forward. And so this is a kind of a very important point. And then if I could go one step further, how about the way of life? You know, the Germans, very solitary, and the Chinese in a group. We rented a condominium in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and we were in a Thai neighborhood, which was really good, but we did have a German neighbor. And we were real close friends with Samoans from New Zealand in Chiang Mai, Thailand, in a Thai neighborhood, okay? But they traveled all the time to China. They were actually focused on China. And so one day we were outside and we saw the German man there, and we said, you know, hey, this is a great place to live, isn't it? And he said, oh yeah, I really like it here. And then we said, do you know this Samoan couple? He said, oh yeah. He said, I live right next door to them. They are the best neighbors I've ever had. And we said, oh yeah, we really like them too. Why do you say that? He says, oh, they're gone all the time. So I thought, there you go. You know, keeping quiet, keeping by himself. That's talking there about the way of life. Now for me, I think I've spent my whole life from that blue position there trying to regain some of what is on the red side. And trying to be more community-oriented and so on. What does it mean for people who are coming into the Christian faith who actually think like that when they read the New Testament? They're coming with perhaps some different perspective. And that's really one of the main things that we can look forward to. But we have a problem. And that problem, and one of my friends in Malaysia says the problem is mangoes and bananas. And the reason he says that, he says Asian Christianity is really, unfortunately, like a banana. It's yellow on the outside and white on the inside. So all the training and all the books that are read, I was traveling all over Asia this last year. Everywhere I went, it was Western books written by Germans and British people and so on that were being put in front of people to read. And he said, wouldn't it be beautiful if Christianity was more like a mango, where it's yellow on the outside, yellow on the inside? He's involved in a project. This book is 20 years old now. It's a great book, Mangoes or Bananas, The Quest for an Authentic Asian Theology and Missiology is what the book is about. Bishop Hua Yung, who's been here in this room, actually, in the past through the Lausanne movement. So I think this is the single biggest challenge for global Christianity. Because you shouldn't go to the other side of the world and feel, if you're from here, let's say, like me, I shouldn't be going to the other side of the world and feel completely comfortable in another culture, because everything that they're doing is just translated from the way that I do things. Now, I read a book on Saturday morning. I don't usually do this, but I usually do read books on Saturday morning. But I'm going to tell you about it because I think this is actually the problem. The book is titled White Awake. What is that? An honest look at what it means to be white. Okay, I'm white, so I read this book. Pastor in Chicago. We follow each other on Twitter. That's how I found about it. And in here he talks about the core problem, and I just bring it up to you now. The core problem is something technically called the normalization of white culture. So listen to this. Let's start with the definition. British sociologist Alistair Bonnet conducted extensive research on white culture in both America and Britain, and he noted that there was something unique about white culture, especially when observed in relation to non-white cultures. In both countries, white culture is the norm by which all other cultural identities are evaluated. White culture is an unchanging and unproblematic location, a position from which all other identities come to be marked by their difference. In plain language, he said that when we attempt to categorize culture internally, we almost always treat white culture as normal. With white culture serving as the baseline, we then evaluate everyone else's culture based on the norms which we associate with white culture. This book, by the way, goes through 7 stages of D Whitening, which is really, that's my term, and they're like the 5 stages of grief, really. You know, there's denial and all of that. It's really good because he himself has wanted to be an advocate for non-white cultures in the United States, but had to go through these 7 stages in order to get to be somewhat useful. Daniel White says he took a seminary class from a white, racially conscious professor who was convinced of this hypothesis, and he regularly challenged his students to engage in self-examination of what we assume to be culturally normal. And here's what he said. He said, each of you will be required to take a handful of core theology classes before you graduate. That's good, you should, but I want to show you something interesting. He powered up the projector, brought an online catalog of classes up on the screen. Watch this, he said. There are the core required classes that are just called theology. But when you go to the electives, you will see that in the spirit of diversity, we offer an additional theology classes, black theology, Latin theology, Asian theology, etc. A question begs itself to be asked. Why do all those theology classes have a modifier before them? Where is the category of white theology? I will answer it for you. You won't find one. The theology passed on to us from white forefathers is considered to be the normal default standard for theology, is the assumed cultural norm. Everyone else's theology is defined in relation to whiteness. So I think this is a big challenge. It's a challenge here at the seminary, of course, but it's a big challenge in global Christianity. We need to de-normalize white culture all around the world, and we might be able to talk a little bit more about that. One reason we might consider doing that is it's not going to be very long by the time when 50% of all Christians in the world are going to be African. So the demographics are continuing to shift, and are we ready for a world in which half of all Christians are Africans? That should say something about who you should be reading and what we should be studying, because that's where we're headed. Another area that's very dear to me is Ethno Doxology. And I spent a lot of time in different places in Asia attending worship services. And I have to tell you, by the way, this quote down here basically says what we just heard about white culture. The dominant culture is assumed to be normal, and it's difficult then for others to go forward. So Trish and I were in Seoul, Korea. We were at a church that looks like a skyscraper, big mega church, and I was speaking to 125 mission people, had a really good time with them, but then I went to the restroom, and this restroom was the low point of my year in Asia, okay? I got to keep talking quickly, okay? Yeah, the reason it was the low point is that they were piping in Korean, a hymn, and it was Onward, Christian Soldiers. So there's a lot of things wrong with this. One is I'm in the restroom. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is this is not really a good hymn to be piping into a missions conference. There's some rethinking that probably needs to be done, even with the English version of it. But to have it in Korean at this critical point, to me, seemed just not good. So we asked, and everywhere we went in Korea, all of the songs we sang, virtually all, were translated from English or German or someplace into Korean. And they love them, and they're good hymns. There's no problem with that. But we talked to a young Korean who actually attended here, got her MDiv here, and she's a musician, but she said there's no market for indigenous Korean music, worship music. It's very difficult. Everything you're either singing hymns from Germany and the U.S., or you're singing Hillsong or stuff from Texas, and all these songs are really good, but they're not really where the future is in seeing the gifts that need to be brought, of course, from people from all over the world. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done here. And think about it, Koreans are one of the strongest missionary sending groups. Are they going to translate Onward Christian Soldiers into Mongolian? They're really strong in Mongolia. Okay, maybe they should eventually, but not right away. Okay, let's give some time for Mongolians to write their own music. And I have to say, for me, I hope I live long enough that when I go to church here in Hamilton, I don't know how long this is going to take, but I hope eventually I go to church, and as we're celebrating Easter, let's say, this hymn was composed in China and has now been translated into English. This hymn was written by Nigerians, this one by Filipinos who are working in Saudi Arabia. I want to sing those songs because I'm part of that global Christian family. The songs I love, I'm Lutheran, so I like Lutheran hymns, but and there's nothing wrong with them. It's just that they shouldn't be dominant. They shouldn't certainly be considered normal for the global Christian life, okay? So anyway, that's one challenge we have. Another challenge is that we're fragmented. We're in 45,000 different denominations. Reminds me of an anecdote I heard of a man who was stranded on a desert island. He was there a long time, and he built 3 huts on the island. Okay, this is why there's 3 huts here. And finally a ship came along to rescue the man. Captain came down on the island and said, "This is amazing, you lived here all of these years. Tell me about your life here." And he said, "Well, this first hut is where I've lived all these years, and this second hut is where I go to church." And the captain said, "Well, what's the third hut?" And he said, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church." So one man on a desert island can't even stay put in the same group. So and especially as Protestants, we have a big challenge with schism. Back in Korea, again, we're keeping track of every Korean denomination. They're splitting so fast that we don't even have time to properly name them. We just call them, something in Korean 1 and something in Korean 2, because they're splitting. It's a crisis, and it's not my assessment. I'm just the Koreans are upset about it too. But it can't be if we're really trying to show people who we are on a global scale. Our resources are not equally divided. This is part of the perpetuation of, let's say, we'll call the normalization of white Christianity, because white Christianity has all the money and the resources. So it tends to be the loudest voice in the room. So that will be something we have to work on. We also know Christians speak a multitude of languages, and what's interesting is the number one mother tongue of Christians worldwide is Spanish. Then we have English, then we have Russian, and then we have, what's next? Somebody help me, because I forgot. Well, Chinese is in the top 5 as well. I forgot Portuguese. Portuguese, thank you, yes. Not because of little Portugal, which is a good place to visit, but because of Brazil, which is teeming with all kinds of Christians. All right, we could, if we had time, which we don't, we could take a regional trip. We'd see things like Africa as a whole, which went from 9% Christian to almost 50%, and that's including the North in these statistics. So that's a transformation. But we also would see Western Asia, which is like Turkey and Syria and Iraq, which was almost a quarter Christian in 1910, and today is on its way to 5, 4, maybe even 3%. So that's not a story of triumph. There's something else going on there. So that also is part of the global Christian story. And we could make our way around the world. But we should say something about religion. First of all, just tell you that we use all kinds of different sources, censuses and surveys and books from religious communities and so on. You can see some of them here. With all these sources, we managed to paint some kind of a picture. And here's that 100-year picture for religion. I showed you Christianity shifting. Here we have religion, and you can see there's 2 big changes if you just had time to look at the difference in size of colors. One of them is that the Chinese folk religionists seem to have disappeared, or at least shrunk, and that's the rise of communism and, the impact of communism. Although there's many studies now showing that even Chinese folk religion might be on the rise now that we're further along. Then the other one is the green, and that's Muslims growing, from 12.6% to 22, 23% now. And that's largely because of demographics, of having babies, okay? Pointing at myself, but, I don't want to point at anybody else either. But having lots of children, very fast demographic growth. Okay, and so if we looked at we know that agnostics and atheists have increased over the century, and you could probably figure out most people in the world in 1900, going back a little further, were religious. By 1970, that had dropped to 80%, and that's, again, the impact of communism. Now, here's the surprising thing, because most of you, if you just walk outside, you walk around Boston, you think, yeah, religion is diminishing. But actually, there's been a resurgence of religion. So by the time we get to 2020, we think 90% of all people in the world belong to a religion. Which is really an amazing thing. So we're living in an increasingly religious world. All right, so our own faith has shifted dramatically to the south, and the world is a more religious place. The most religious place is Asia. Religiously diverse place is Asia. And Singapore is the most religiously diverse country in the world. The reason is because no religion in Singapore is over 30% of the population, all right, which is not true most places, not in the United States either. By the way, just to keep on this theme, the white culture theme, most of the books for Christians in Singapore to navigate religion are written by people from the West. People from the West did not grow up in religious diversity. Singaporeans did. So one of the things I did when I was in Asia, I said, look, you got to stop reading these books. We got to start writing your own books, Because when I was in Singapore, I looked at a newspaper one day. It said 9 out of 10 Singaporeans are comfortable living and working with people of other ethnicities and religions. And I just read some research back in the United States, maybe 1 out of 10 Americans are comfortable. So who should write the books? Who should we be listening to about religious diversity? There's brilliant people in this country, but look, I think we need to see a reverse in the direction of where information is coming from. I want to read Thai and Malaysian and Singaporean and Indonesian. I spent time in Indonesia. I want to read their reflections on how to get along with Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists. All right, the world's becoming more diverse because people are moving all over the place, and this study showed that the majority are actually Christians and Muslims. So Christians are 33% of the world's population, remember? But half of all the migrants in the world are Christians, which makes it very odd for Christians to oppose migration, by the way, but that's a separate problem. So the world's getting increasingly diverse. My favorite story about this is that in 1979, or 78, I left Minnesota, I went to Los Angeles, got missionary training, Youth with a Mission, and then I went to Thailand. And I had never met a Buddhist, I'd never met a Thai person until I got to Bangkok, and then I worked in Thailand for a while. Just a couple of months ago, I went back to my mother's house in Minneapolis, where I grew up, and I opened the bedroom window, and I looked out, and standing there was the neighbor, who is Thai, living next door to my mother. So I went all the way to the other side of the world to meet my first Thai person, but now a Thai person lives next to my mother. That's the difference that we see. And certainly I'm glad my mom's a very welcoming Lutheran, so this Thai person feels very welcome in that neighborhood, and they become good friends. The other thing we should keep in mind is there's been a massive shift, if you think of a couple of hundred years, in the composition of the world's religious population, and that is that in 1800, a third of the world's population was either Christian or Muslim. All right, that's in 1800. We think by 2100, which would be 300 years later, 66% of the world's population will be either Christian or Muslim. So this has got to be a very important relationship, just demographically speaking, between Christians and Muslims. Okay, trends in global mission. These are Brazilian missionaries. That's one of the trends, is people being sent out from different places all around the world, which is something you can anticipate. But recent research of ours has shown that 86% of Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists do not personally know a Christian. I think this is our biggest mission challenge. So our biggest Christian challenge is having Christianity look and feel like all the people that represent it culturally. All right? The biggest religious challenge might be religious diversity or Christianity and Islam. Biggest mission challenge is that these people that are not Christians do not know us personally. And that's bad for an incarnational faith like ours. I mean, if Jesus chose to come and live as a baby and model that kind of weak approach, let's say, to mission, that's all that we have. If people are not our friends or don't know us personally, we really have not done what we're supposed to be doing. Now, let me push a little bit. Should Germans, pardon me again, I'm a quarter German. Should Germans tell us how we should get along and know other people in other religions personally? I just don't think that's where the intelligence comes from or the experience. Or let's put it this way, intuition. That's what I think Singaporeans have on this, is they have the intuition. And the fact that they can live and work with other people, we need to read their books. We need to fly them here and listen to them because they're going to know better than other people what to do. We also have a problem that the world is increasingly urban. You're probably aware of. The UN did a study that shows 1 in 6 people live in slums. Okay, but only 1 in 500 missionaries live in slums, and this is a problem. Now, there's Christian slums, but there's also largely Muslim and Buddhist and Hindu slums. Then another challenge for us is inequality and social justice. That's going to require a lot of energy, and certainly we heard it even in the last couple of days about the need for a more integrated faith. Integral mission, which, by the way, that phrase was not designed by Europeans or Americans. It came from Latin America, where they, from the very beginning, saw real problems with separating evangelism and social action. So now we want integral mission, and that's the way forward for us. Okay, so what should we do? Okay, I'm going to just suggest a few quick things, and then we can have some questions. How about on the subject of identification, how you identify yourself with this fragmentation? Okay, I adapted what was considered the funniest Christian joke ever. Now, I shouldn't have said that, because now it won't be funny. But I adapted it because it wasn't the best context. So I put it into a guy who in the United States, when you want to marry, like I had to with Ralph Winter's daughter, I had to go to Ralph Winter and ask, okay, and it's really nerve-wracking, especially when you have to do calculations. So this is the joke that's related to asking for a father's daughter in marriage. I have 3 daughters, and actually my daughter's boyfriend is flying in about 2 hours. Now, he's not going to ask for a hand in marriage, but I'm nervous anyway, just because of this. Okay, so just follow the joke. I shouldn't have said all that. Okay, once this guy asked to marry my daughter. Got it? The father said, "Do you believe in God?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Are you a Christian or a Jew?" He said, "A Christian." I said, "Me too. Protestant or Catholic?" He said, "Protestant." I said, "Me too. Which franchise?" He said, "Baptist." I said, "Me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" He said, "Northern Baptist." I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist." I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region?" He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region." I said, "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? He said, "Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. I said, "Go away, you will never marry my daughter." Okay, so the problem is too much identification with all the little groups that we have within Christianity. So let's try to get past that. How about reducing duplication and competition? This is a big problem. I mean, people call me all the time and ask, where should we send missionaries? One time, this brand new denomination in the U.S. that split off said, "We're so tired of all those other people. Now we've got just the good people, and we want to send out missionaries where no one's ever gone before." So I said, "Where are you going to send them?" They said, "Manila in the Philippines." And I said, "There's lots of missionaries there, and there's lots of indigenous churches. All kinds of stuff is going on." So they said, "Where do you think we should send our people?" I said, "Well, how about North Korea or Somalia or Afghanistan?" All right, yeah. So they said, "Well, we'll pray about that." All right. So 6 months later, they called me back and said, "We're so excited. We've laid hands on our team, and we're sending them out where no one's ever been before." And I said, "Oh, where are you going?" And they said, "Manila in the Philippines." And I said, "Well, wait, I thought we talked about this." And they said, no, look, we sent an exploratory team there, and we didn't find any Christians just like us." And I thought, okay, that's the big problem. So we got to watch that. Then, who are we actually? Are we just a divided community with all of these pieces, or are we a unified community? Okay, that's a Korean car, by the way. I had a German car there for a long time. I put a Korean car there. Okay, so this is who we are. This is what global Christianity is. Global Christianity, the reason we study it here is we're so excited about all the connections in global Christianity. And that's what makes it global, is the connections. It's part of why your experience here is going to be so good, because there's people from all over the world who are here working together. So that's what makes it special. We also want to rescue those being swept away, and we have a big challenge in this area. We've got some great relief and development groups, but we have a lot more work to do, and we've got to watch the duplication and competition in this area. There's about 300 NGOs in Chiang Mai where I live, and many work together, but many do not as well. So we just have to be careful. Then we better teach our people about what is going on in other world religions. We want our people, Christians, to know well what Muslims believe, what Hindus believe, and so on. And actually, part of our own contribution as a center to the seminary, on November 2nd, right in this room, we're going to have the former General Secretary of the Baha'i Faith is going to be here. He's a friend of mine who lives in Boston, and he's coming up to talk to us about what is the Baha'i Faith. It is the most spread out faith in the world besides Christianity, and it's only 7 million people. It's a really remarkable story, and they're far more accomplished in racial reconciliation than Christians are. I always tell them this. I think this is a good practice with people in other religions. Find something that you can appreciate and tell them, build them up with the truth, because they have done a fantastic job. They were integrated in the United States in the 1920s, and have proven a great deal of that spirit over the last 100 years here. Then we better empower Christians to interact in religiously diverse communities. And we better get that intelligence from Christians who have this intuitive sense of what it means. That's who I want to listen to in relation to this. We better anticipate improving Christian-Muslim relations. This is from medieval Spain. This is a very important relationship. So is Christian-Hindu, Christian-Buddhist, and so on. But remember the demographics behind this one. And then, how about encouraging hospitality? As one of the, I think this is the key word for mission in the 21st century, because the key problem is lack of friendship and personal contact between Christians and Muslims. This is my dining room. This is Thanksgiving, and these are my wife's students from Park Street, where she teaches ESL. We invite them every year. They come from all over the world. Most of them are non-Christians. They're in our home for Thanksgiving, and we go around the table and say, how long have you been here? 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Have you ever been invited to an American home? No, this is the first time. Every year, year after year, that we've done this. So there's a problem, again, people that, because hospitality is Christian virtue, So if the dominant culture is not a hospitable culture, and I dare say there are plenty of hospitable people in that culture pushing back against it, which is what you have to do. Even me, I'd rather stay at home and read a book, but my wife constantly invites people to our house. It's such a great bother. But I have learned over the years that this is part of my own journey to welcome people, and it's just been so fulfilling. And then finally, let's live like a true global community that we are. We are demographically global. Let's show people what that looks like. It does not look like white Christianity. White Christianity has made lots of contributions, and I'm not saying it's bad, it just shouldn't be dominant. So we need to denormalize white Christianity. That's maybe what we need to do, is denormalize it. It's still going to produce all kinds of great things, but it can't be considered the baseline for everything that we're doing. That really hurts us as to our witness as a global Christian community. And this is my last slide here. We just need to reverse the flow of listening. Listen to Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and Islanders about what the future is of our faith. I think this is what I learned by spending another year in Thailand, is this is where we're going in the future. And that doesn't diminish us, it builds us up, it shows who we truly are. And so I just commend that to you as we took this quick trip through Christianity, religion, and mission. All right, let's open up for questions. Do we have a thing? No, sorry. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I was looking at the Global Atlas of Christianity earlier and noticing there was a map of the world that was colored in different colors for majority religious populations in various parts of the world. So we have North America and Europe are predominantly blue for Christianity, parts of Africa as well. Then there's a significant green window for Islam, and I think it was pink for Hinduism, and so on. And it occurred to me that if you look at the green and pink countries, the cultures that are associated with those predominant religions are characterized by ideologies that are specific to the dominant religions in those areas. But if you look at European and North American culture, as opposed to the statistics of people who are individually claiming to be Christians, there's a lot of influence in our cultures that we owe more to secular Enlightenment philosophy than to Christianity itself. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this rather odd phenomenon and how we can engage with people from other religious cultures without being associated with the non-Christian elements of a culture that's supposed to be predominantly Christian and isn't necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's why whenever you have maps, you've got to have commentary and analysis, because beneath the maps are all kinds of interesting dynamics. I'd say there's at least two interesting things related to that. One is that I think Christians and non-Christians in the Western world have to get used to the idea that the world's becoming more religious, and therefore conversations can be more religious, let's say, especially when you travel or when people come to your country and want to talk about religion. It's healthy for Westerners to become less secular in that sense. But it's also important, I think, this is where, like white Christianity has had some advantage, let's say, in interacting with secularism and learning how to navigate it. It's not all done right, but secularism is actually, or secularization is continuing around the world, even in the midst of this resurgence. And actually it's interesting because all over Asia, people are asking me, what do we do about encroaching secularization? So I think that is a case where Christians who've had several hundred years to get used to this, or maybe 100 years in particular, can actually make a contribution in the other direction and have something to say about it. So we've got both sides having to learn something. And then another thing, of course, would be for Africa in particular, countries that were 4% Christian in 1900 are 85% Christian today. So the question is, what do they look like 50 years from now? Do they look like Europe in the sense of this conflation of church and state and those sort of things? So there's a lot of dynamics and the need for a lot of dialogue across those different lines. Anyone else?
I'll throw one out there over here. So on listening to Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and Islanders, do you have a resource for books that you would recommend reading? I guess my question is, where do we start on that as far as getting out of the standard Western bibliographies and a lot of the textbooks that we read?
Yeah, no, the fortunate thing is that there are increasing numbers of anthologies and that sort of thing. We collect them down at the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, but there's plenty in Goddard now, too. Latin American theologians meeting and publishing, and so we have access, I think, increasing access to that, although a lot more needs to happen. It's a separate, you remember what he said in here about the seminary where there's standard theology and then there's contextual theologies. And one Latin America said the starting point for seeing a change in this area is Western people acknowledging that all theology is contextual. In other words, you're not free completely of culture and perspective. So I'd say we have those two tasks. One is to listen, and the other is to D Whiten or deconstruct in a positive sense in order to provide a dialogue. Let me tell you one of my favorite books, which I have at the center. It has nothing to do with Christianity, but I think it says a lot about this. It's a book on music, and it's called The Other Classical Musics. And I bought the book, and I opened it up, and I looked, and I was really quite surprised, because this is where we see this change. So there's actually there's Indonesian, Javanese music, and Thai music, and Chinese, but then all of a sudden, there's 15 chapters. All of a sudden, there's a chapter on Western music. And that what the authors are saying is that they're all others. There's not a privileged music, and then there's all these contextual musics. Every music is contextual, and the Western music, which is beautiful, a great tradition, is just listed with the others. That's the decentering, the denormalizing that needs to happen. So I think we have both. We need to listen, and we need to think critically about our own backgrounds, which it's a positive exercise, because every culture has weaknesses, and you don't really see those weaknesses till you travel or you begin to dialogue with other people. And so I think this isn't going to be for those of us who are from white backgrounds. It's not going to be a terrible thing. It's going to be a wonderful thing to go forward that way. So, yeah.
So
Okay,
on
first
that,
here, and then
go ahead.
Sorry.
go ahead.
So you talk a lot about the necessity of de-whitening, especially as Christianity spreads in Africa and Asia and South America. But we're seeing a lot of people from, especially North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and South America, go to Europe to start evangelizing. What would your recommendation be to them? Do they also have to fit into this context, or do they share their own thoughts, their own cultural background there?
Yeah, no one tells anybody what else to do, and shouldn't. But in a situation like this, I think it's part of that bridge building that is going on for Europeans, to be able to see what it's like for Africans to live in Europe, and how their witness is perhaps a little different. And Africans, by the way, of course, is a cover term for a continent, and there's huge diversity in Africa. So depending on who you're meeting, you're going to have a very different experience. But I think the positive side is the cross-fertilization. And there'll be a learning process there. And I think, Europeans, Germans, let's talk about Germans again. So many Germans have left the church. What happens when an African congregation in Berlin witnesses to a Berliner and they bring him into the church? What's the future for that young person, let's say? That's a really interesting question. And it shouldn't be prescribed by anything except, what the particular context is there. To have a rich heritage right where you are, like many of us were in Wittenberg just recently. So to be standing there and then have the gospel go to Africa and then come back and be, saved in that context is pretty interesting. Should they say? Are you asking, should they sing African songs? Well, I don't know. They might. Wouldn't hurt if the balance went the other way for a while, but. Well, I just think the fundamental principle, which Andrew Walls, who just wrote another book recently here, he says there's two principles that need to be kept, and they're almost always in tension. One is called the indigenization principle, where every culture in the world receives the Christian gospel as a seed, and it grows up into a unique plant within that culture. So that's the local side. But then he says, the Bible's quite clear that we're all aliens here on the planet. And so we're connected globally by the fact that we all belong to this heavenly community, this kingdom. And so there's a tension between the depth of our faith expressed within our culture and language, and yet the commonality across all of what's going on around the world. What I'm saying is that this white history suppresses those local expressions. That's bad. So what we need is the local expressions in communion and conversation with each other. And no one can say what that looks like exactly. But I think personally, I have grown a great deal by having contact with those local expressions. I feel like I'm a better Christian for knowing Thai Christians. I'm a better Christian for knowing Indonesian Christians of various kinds. So, to me, that's part of what's going on. I think we're just one more question. Yeah.
So I agree. The cultural thing, building up the indigenous pastors and the leadership is so important. But you also got to look. You preach not your culture, but the word, and so that's kind of been our approach. One thing that I was concerned, or is always my concern, is how is your approach impacting women in these nations where women are often not on the same level as the male leadership?
Right, okay, so each culture has its different strengths and weaknesses, and it's the encounter with the scriptures that is going to transform culture. And as far as the role of women goes, I think that's where much of the work needs to be done. But if there's particular cultures that have had success in this area, and I wouldn't say, have you read Half the Sky or The Confidence Code? Or these books are showing that in the West, which is claiming to have equality, there's fundamental problems underneath of inequality that are similar to a lot of the economic ones. So I wouldn't, Western people can't just go, to brand new Saudi Arabian Christians and say, now let me give you some advice, about treatment of women. I think it's more complicated than that. And it's really best if the people themselves can encounter this in their own study. But then, talking with people in other Christian cultures or backgrounds, being able to compare notes. So I think there's all kinds of transformation that needs to take place. It would make sense in the same way as I said about religion for people that have had a success in that area to offer some advice to other Christians in other cultures that are struggling with the role of women.